and welcome to episode 127 of the PowerScore LSAT podcast. I'm Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley.
And I'm John Dinning in Los Angeles.
John, how's life in Los Angeles?
Life's pretty good, man. I feel like we're out of that kind of January gray, cold slump. Not that I'm outdoors much these days, but it is pretty to look at.
Outdoors much or ever?
Some. I will say this, we get a month between tests here, so maybe we'll get to both explore a little bit in March.
Yes, I'll be taking some trips soon. Back, in fact, to our old stomping grounds.
You're going to have to be way more specific.
In this case, Hilton Head Island in South Carolina.
Old stomping grounds.
Very old.
Where it all began.
The good times.
Yeah.
Going back to see family there, but got family arriving today who's actually going to watch the house, so we're in good shape.
Oh, that's nice. Well, I'll say this. Watch this segue. Anytime I hear Hilton Head, the first thing I think of is cocktails. So, Dave, what are you drinking?
You know, I'm feeling rather aggressive today, so I am drinking what is known as a campfire fireball.
Okay.
I had a bunch of fireball at the Halloween party that we had a while back, and so this mixes like fireball along with Maker's Mark, and then a bunch of juices like peach juice, cranberry juice, throw a little rum in there and grenadine. It's definitely high octane, and that's how I'm feeling today.
Nice. I like it. Yeah. Family coming into town. You're feeling aggressive. It should end really.
My mother-in-law.
Should end great.
So,
mother-in-law?
Ready.
Oh, God.
Yeah, getting ready by downing a lot of drinks. What about you?
Oh, I was inspired a little bit by the Super Bowl. I watched Chris Stapleton do the national anthem at the Super Bowl. And all full credit to Rihanna, but he was my musical highlight. So, based on the song that I also chose for us today, which is probably his biggest hit, Tennessee Whiskey, I ordered myself a bottle of George Dickel Barrel Select whiskey. I'm drinking that on, well, what used to be rocks, now they're melted. But I'm drinking some Tennessee whiskey, and Chris Stapleton is my hero.
Well, there you go. I will say the game overshadowed all musical performances for me, but it was a great game, and that at least I can enjoy, and I didn't really care who won. I just wanted to see a good ending.
Yeah, there's something to be said about just a good game where you don't have any stakes on it. You didn't care about the teams. Neither one of us bet for once.
Yeah, I guess I was pro Chiefs, but that's mainly because as a Vikings fan, you're kind of anti all the other NFC teams.
There you go. All right, well, I think that covers us drinks and songs. You want to get into the LSAT world?
Immediately, let's get to it.
Yeah.
So the big news and what we'll be talking about today is the February 2023 LSAT. We'll be recapping that. All the main test administration is now over. What is remaining, however, is the makeup test, which is coming up, I believe, next Wednesday, the 22nd of February. And then thereafter, everybody who takes this test, including the makeup testers, will get their scores on March 1st. And that is a fortuitous date because it is one day before the registration for the April LSAT closes. Mm-hmm. So if you're thinking to yourself, get my scores back, what should I do? You will have the option of taking April. Some people will be taking that as their first LSAT. A lot of test takers who are taking April right now are using it to get off the wait list. They're using it to improve their scholarship reconsideration requests and so forth. So it has a lot of utility for that group. And then that test in April is on the 14th and 15th with scores coming out in very early May.
Yeah, May 3rd, I think, is when those scores come out. So there you go. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, if you're thinking about taking that April test, and especially if you're a first-time test taker, we've got a bunch of free seminars coming up. A few that I think are really interesting to you and I, John. We've got one on that 22nd of February, the same date as the makeup testers. That's the parallel reasoning webinar that we do that I think is really awesome. Then there's one on March 8th about comparative reading and reading comprehension. And then, John, you and I will gather together along with some of our friends and do the crystal ball for the April and June LSATs on March 15th, 4 days after my birthday. So hopefully I will be not hangover by that point.
Still drunk, ready to roll. Us and a few thousand of our friends will be there on the 15th of March for that crystal ball.
Yeah. And then there's another webinar at the end of March on the 29th about circular games, which I think if you just took the February LSAT, some of you would be like, wish I'd seen that earlier, although we do it on a regular basis. So that's been out there. But circular games definitely back in play on the LSAT these days, so something to very well be aware of.
Yeah, for sure. Those are exciting. What I always tell people is, listen, even if some of this may not feel entirely pertinent or relevant to you, like, for instance, you're good at comparative reading for Reading Comp, these are free and they're a good chance to engage with instructors and also just engage with a kind of cohort of strangers on the same path as you. So get signed up, take the hour, attend these things, and engage, participate, interact. There's always something to be gained, even if the topic itself maybe doesn't strike the same chord as some other ones might.
And interestingly enough, if you attend those webinars, we actually offer you a discount on taking a course. And the last time we did this podcast, John, we talked about getting a special discount for podcast listeners. And that was due to expire here in the next week, but they've had such a good response to it, they've extended it until the end of March. So if you are a podcast listener and you're thinking about taking either the live online or the on-demand course, you can get a discount by using the code PODJAN23. So PS Pod Jan 23. It's case sensitive, all lowercase. And the other thing that we've been focusing on, because you and I have been asking marketing for more discounts for listeners, book readers, and so forth. The new 2023 LSAT Bibles are out. There's kind of an Easter egg of discounts in there. Including one that allows you to take the first month of the on-demand course for $1, which I think is pretty cool, as well as a significant discount off the live online. And unfortunately, you can't combine all these different discounts. It's only a single use, but they are floating around out there if you are looking for them. So either use that code here from the podcast, or maybe if you have the 2023 LSAT Bibles, there's a way to access that through. There's directions in the book.
Yeah, let me reiterate that point you just made about the Bibles and that on-demand first month, because I think this would be an easy thing for people to overlook when, in fact, it's about a $400 bonus feature, really, if you buy one of these new Bibles. Any of the Bibles this will apply for, you'll get a unique code as part of the book, and it'll grant you access to the entire on-demand course for a full month for $1. It's normally $395 for that first month. We're doing it for $1. So in a way, there's almost a hack here. If you were thinking about that course, buy the book first and get in cheaper.
You know, I'm not one for hyperbole, but I would say that's got to be the best deal in the LSAT world that you can possibly get.
It's pretty ridiculous, yeah.
At least that's kind of cool. We're able to get marketing to kind of line up the stars there for that. And I don't know how long that'll last, but that's what the situation is right now. So take advantage of it if you're going to be taking one of these upcoming LSATs and you want further assistance.
Yeah, I'm loving things lately, man. Manipulating the marketing crew to our own kind of selfish needs for the podcast folks, for the Bibles readers. This has been a lot of fun. Let's hope we can keep it up.
Are you saying we're the masterminds behind all of this?
Puppeteers, David. Puppeteers.
Driving force is what I'd like to call it. And on that note, let's talk about the February 2023 LSAT and get into a breakdown of that exam, some of the things that happened, things that we saw, and then run through the content, and then ultimately scale predictions based upon the overall difficulty of this test. So as I already mentioned, we will see the score release for this exam on Wednesday, March 1st. That'll come out at around 9 a.m. Eastern Time. Retakers will get their scores at the same time. So let's take a look at what we had, because what we have looked at is we had test takers on Friday and Saturday, kind of like the two main administration days. And then we also had test takers on Tuesday, the 14th, Valentine's Day, the worst Valentine's Day present that I can possibly imagine someone having to get taking the LSAT. And then we've got the makeups coming. So when we look at Friday, you had a very small group, about 3,900 people take the test. And then on Saturday, it was bigger, unsurprisingly, get away from school and work. That was about 5,000 students. And then the Valentine's Day group, usually the paper and pencil makeup is around 250. This time it was around 150. So overall, you're going to have about 9,000 people take this test, which is relatively small. Not the smallest, certainly not large, not in the 20,000 range that we see with other tests. This is about 1,200 more than we saw last year for the February test. So that's unsurprising, though, because we don't have a March test this year. So that would have sucked away some of the additional people, and that's what they had last year. So a little bit bigger than last year, but there are reasons for that. And overall, what do you think of the test administration, John, in terms of difficulty, problems?
Yeah,
things that
we
you
should
saw?
talk about the Proctor U and the general technical and administrative issues here. And it's funny because we've been on a pretty good roll with things. Even January, we talked a lot about how things seem to be going pretty smoothly. LSAC seemed to have a pretty good system down. Proctor U was performing as contracted and expected. This test, I'm afraid to say, seems like a bit of a regression, a step in the wrong direction.
Let's talk a little bit about that because I didn't see the number of problems that you did. I didn't realize that you were seeing as many problems until, in fact, we started talking about this just the other day. I think you had a number of students that you work with individually who ran into testing problems. You have like 4 or 5 who had some serious issues, including one test taker from the Tuesday administration who just had a total nightmare.
Yeah, I'll keep her anonymous, but I had a paper and pencil tester yesterday who had about a 3 to 4 hour delay getting logged in with ProctorU and getting set up. Once she did, she was consistently booted out. And granted, this is with a setup and a machine and protocol and everything that she's done before, and she's taking the paper test, so it's not even a terrible technological burden. They're not even displaying questions on the screen. It's really just a proctor and a timer. And as she got to the last passage in her final section, the proctor told her that her computer was in violation of security protocol and stopped her test and wouldn't let her finish. Despite her testing for hours up to that point and testing in January with the same machine, no issues there. So clearly there were a number of hiccups, is really too polite a way to put it. But there were a number of issues that we saw this time. Some of them were due to LSAC's system crashing. We know it crashed yesterday, as of this recording, yesterday the 14th. Today it crashed again, went down for a while, the 15th. So that caused problems, but I saw just a lot of complaints about how bad ProctorU was this time. I think it's high time LSAC maybe takes a little inventory of exactly what's being delivered in terms of what they're paying for and what their clients are getting, because they're not getting what they deserve.
Yeah, it's always, we've said this before, even in the best administrations, there's always problems. And if you have a problem, it's instantaneously catastrophic because it's interfering with an extremely important test that has long-term implications. And really, it's the only acceptable goal here is 0% problems. It may not be realistic, but that has to be the goal. I did not see as many issues as you saw individually. There's always some. So I know that's almost built into the entire system. It's structural, so to speak. I did talk to one of the students who I chat with after a lot of these tests, and they had, again, another issue where they could not finish the test. And this has gone on so many times that it's almost like, I'm not going to say they're cursed, but it feels like the system just does not want them to finish the exam. So I had that come in, and so I've had the examples. I didn't see anything systemically. I do think you might be right about the fact that the technical issues might have caused some delays for the Tuesday test takers. But beyond that, I didn't see anything systemic floating around. But again, it doesn't really matter. If you're a test taker who had a problem and somebody interrupted you, yeah, it's ProctorU. Typically, that is the issue. They're the ones that are actually going through this. It doesn't really matter. It's the LSAT. Whoever's the vendor is irrelevant. All of a sudden, there's somebody singing during your test or taking your mouse or telling you that there's a problem. You haven't moved your head, but they can't see you. All of that is massively disruptive, especially if the proctor doesn't pause the test, and so many of them don't.
To clarify, that's a specific reference to another issue my student yesterday had happened. The proctor turned on the mic and started singing some sort of foreign language lullaby or something, to which she then had to tell the proctor to shut up. It was just one thing after another, a comedy of errors. I think part of this, too, is magnified and made more potent by the fact that this is, for many people, their last shot at going to law school this year. February is sort of a make-or-break test in many, many cases. So when you have an issue, say, in October, and you've got multiple fallbacks in these safety nets of November and January, it sucks, but you don't feel like all hope is lost. It's not going to cost you an entire year. When that happens in February and you're unable to complete the test, you could very well just be sitting around for an entire year before you're able to actually reapply. So I know that certainly fueled some fire here.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point because, also sensed that there was more consternation after this test, a little bit more hand-wringing and being upset about it. And if you think about it, when the pressure gets higher and higher, that's a natural response. You're already under pressure. Then you're thinking, maybe this is my last shot. That amps it up even more. I think that can create a pressure cooker environment that really puts people on edge. So that's something to think about, especially as I bring up the point that I will in a moment about some of the disclaimers that we like to make in advance of this, which I will now engage in.
All right, we ready for this?
And then we'll get to the actual test summary discussion. All right, so a series of things. We just like to remind people of various kinds of points that we're making about this podcast and the information that we have. And the very first one is please don't summarize this online. I say this all the time. I'll say it again, probably at least 3 more times today. Summaries often miss the nuance of what we're doing. We want people to hear what we say directly. The podcast is free and shouldn't be that difficult. I'm always disappointed when I see summaries online, and this would disappoint me as well. How we do this is not really public knowledge, and we're not really willing to explain everything that we do, although we do use some of the public information that we have. We look at various reports from test takers, from instructors who have taken the test. We have a massive database that has been created over decades now that tracks test use way back, and we take information that we receive, compare it to that database, take a look at what we know. We can see when tests were used before, when certain questions were used before. Sometimes it was 3 years ago, sometimes it was 2 years ago, sometimes it was 12 years ago. But we're able to fit all those pieces together to get an assessment not only of what's real and what's experimental, but also of the difficulty. That's what we use to make our scale predictions. Beyond that, we're not going to disclose any further information about how we do it because it's proprietary to us. It is secret. So I will also make a reminder about test order. Every single exam I see people say, this was my test order, and people chime in and say, yeah, I had that same test. You may have, you may not have. For example, if you had LR first and third, you might have had the same 2 LR in that order. Your order might have been reversed. Sometimes you didn't have the same 2 LR. They change sections and orders all day long. Do not rely upon section order as being indicative. You'll often see people talking about that first one was harder, and someone will come in and say, no, the second one was harder. And if you were able to see what content those people had, you'd realize that they're talking about different sections. When we talk about disclosing test information, especially students, once you get past Tuesday, you're allowed to really talk about the test in terms of topics and generalities. That's why we're able to do this podcast. LSAC does not want you talking about specifics or solutions or answer choices that you might have selected, so you can avoid that. But you can talk about the generalities and the topic, especially once you get past that Tuesday. Going back to the point I made just as we were opening this kind of segment, when you take the LSAT for real, it almost always feels worse than a practice test. Mm-hmm. It's a pressurized situation. It's not the same as sitting at your house or the library taking it. There's a negativity bias that creeps into your recollections. And as we were just talking, when you come to tests like February, which is the last chance for a lot of people, where they feel it's the last chance, it gets even worse. So a lot of people are almost preconditioned to walk out of an exam like this feeling terrible. Saw a lot of online chatter that was really negative about this test and the experience and the difficulty of it. Just keep in mind that you can get affected. It is unlikely that LSAT after LSAT, you're going to see the hardest ever LSAT, but that is often the comment that people make online. And it's not that they're lying or they're just making something up. It actually feels that way to them, but that's because they're viewing it through this very pressurized filter that tends to make that feeling that much more real. In that same vein, when we talk about a section being easier or harder, keep in mind that we're always of the opinion that LSAT sections and tests are hard already. We're talking about a very high difficulty exercise. So if I say something's easier, it's still hard. It's just on the easier side of that difficulty. If something's really hard, we're talking about super elite difficulty. So that doesn't happen quite as much. But nothing is easy on this test. It is all relative, but it's in that hard scaling that is right there. Keep in mind also that the test makers are actively attempting to confuse you by placing the same topics in multiple sections. So when you're talking to other people, realize that just saying, oh, I had the passage about chili doesn't necessarily mean that you were talking about the same passage. There are many instances of them intentionally inserting the same topic in different sections. It's been happening for a while. It's a known tactic that they use. We also make estimations about what is real and experimental. So far, we haven't been wrong. We don't expect to be wrong today, but they are based upon certain assumptions about reusage, namely that if we know for a fact that a section was used previously as a scored section, we believe that when they bring it back, they do not use it as an experimental section. It is tagged as real, so be aware of that. It's also possible that you won't hear your section discussed today. That could be for a couple different reasons. A, you might not remember the questions. It might have been a blur to you and you just don't recognize the questions that we mentioned. This happens. I've had plenty of students in the past for release tests say, I don't remember any of that. And they get the test back and it's the exact same test we were just talking about. This one won't be disclosed, so we won't have that opportunity. There's also the possibility that some people had sections that were relatively limited in terms of their usage. They were not widespread. If that's the case, we may not have heard about those test section usages. And sometimes people just don't give us the information. They don't share it. They don't disclose it to us. And if that's the case, there's nothing we can do if we don't hear about that usage. There's no way for me to connect it back to a database if I didn't hear about the test being used initially. All right, and then the last thing, please don't summarize this online. Just have people listen to the podcast. We'd prefer to have our words interpreted directly, especially on a test like this, which has some nuance in certain areas. John, on that note, let's get into that domestic test.
Yeah, let's do it. Easily my favorite part of these test recaps is when you do the disclaimers and I get to just put my feet up and drink for 10 minutes. So thank you.
I don't know if that was 10 minutes.
I don't know.
That was less than that.
It felt like 10 minutes. I did 10 minutes worth of drinking. I don't know how long it took. I appreciate you doing the heavy lifting there. I'll see if I can take some of the burden as we get into the test content itself.
Maybe I should just say you do it all.
I'm happy to. This is the fun part anyway. Let's talk about what we saw. This time there weren't international tests, so we're just going to focus on the domestic February exam. Let's talk about what we first saw out of the gates Friday morning. And one of the first things that we noticed was that some of the content that was being used for people was recognizable. It was things we had seen before, which when you make the kind of crystal ball predictions that you and I make is obviously a very relevant thing and something we track closely. In this case, however, LSAT did something that we have talked a little bit about as a possibility, kind of unnerving possibility, I suppose, or one that would put us in a bit of a bind for predictions, which is that they double and triple dipped into tests that they'd used previously. In other words, the reuses that we saw here, and I'll get more specific in a second, weren't first reuses. In some cases, they were second reuses or partial reuses of tests that had been reused elsewhere. That makes for an almost impossible situation for predictions.
Okay, so let me clarify that.
Yeah.
Because what you're really referring to is the crystal ball stuff that we do where we predict things. And one of the things that is in there is a disclaimer where when I get to that portion where we make those predictions, I say, look, we're assuming that they're not going to go back and reuse tests that have already been used in the last couple of years. They've now done that, though, on two separate occasions that I can immediately recall. And
really reuse tests. So if we've seen them reuse this once, we don't expect that they're going to do it again. We think they'll pick something clean instead. That's what we tend to base predictions off of.
Yeah, it doesn't affect how we assess difficulty or what we know. In fact, it actually helps us because we've already seen these multiple times. But I will tell you that when we go to that March crystal ball, I will make mention of this particular fact of like these tests, which normally we wouldn't say are in play as possibilities, they are coming back in play now. It's like they got benched for a while, and instead of saying, that's it, you're retired, Now they're bringing them back, and that opens up many more options for what LSAC can present on any individual test because they're not limited to just those fresh or once-used tests.
Yeah, and of course makes our predictive lives that much harder because instead of just having a handful of clean tests like we predicted here in January and February, we could have dozens potentially of tests that are suddenly candidates if they do this double, triple dipping. So what we did for January, we nailed it. We guessed the exact test they were going to use because it was the first reuse of it. In February, they did something different, and I'll explain what that was now, which is specifically what we saw on Friday morning is they began to reuse content from the January 2021 LSAT. We saw it with games, and we saw it with reading comprehension. In fact, this is the second reuse of those reading comprehension passages. So let's get into what they actually were and what we saw. And I'll start with games. This is probably the cleanest of the bunch, maybe LR. Here's what we saw with logic games. There was a real section of logic games Friday morning, 23 questions. And again, first seen in January of 2021. These 4 games. The first was about 6 classes, math and physics, over a semester. The second game was about a lawyer and litigant cases of different types, finance, government, and I believe investment. The third game was a 5-person medical panel being selected from 10 different professionals, doctors, nurses, and social workers. And then finally, an interesting and tricky game at the end, which was 5 articles in a journal or a magazine, and it talked about where they started, what page number they began on, 1 through 5, but then they potentially continued on pages later, which were pages 16, 17, and 18. So you had to kind of track where they began and where they potentially finished over some span of pages. It was a tough game.
It's probably the last one was probably the hardest of the 4, wouldn't you say?
Of that section, for sure. Although the third game I heard a lot of people say was time-consuming, that medical panel with the doctors and nurses.
All right.
Yeah, in terms of just raw difficulty, game 4 was definitely the standout.
So that section was real. If you had that section and you went through it, you know it was scored because in all likelihood, from what we're seeing, that was your only logic game section. So what about the other logic game section that we saw that was also scored?
Yeah, we first started seeing these, at least with any real frequency, on Saturday morning. So that first set was mostly Friday. The second set was mostly Saturday. Some intermixing. 23 questions as well. These games were new, in the sense that we couldn't immediately pin them to a past usage. Here were the 4 games in this real section. The first was about 6 volunteer shifts over the course of a week, 7 days. There was a second game in there about 3 different conferences with different criterion, I suppose. Different cities, different presenters, different topics for these conferences. The third game was about 5 fiction and nonfiction books being selected out of a total of 9. And then again, to cap things off and finish with a bit of a bang, the fourth game was about 8 honorees divided into 2 tables of 4 people each. Circular. Double circular.
A double circular in a different way than what we've seen before.
Not tiered circular, but just 2 tables.
Yeah. There's another notable example that's floating around there. I think that's originally from February 2014. That is 8 people around a table, but they have characteristics. So it's almost like an advanced linear game wrapped around a table. This is a different type of double circular game. This is actually 2 circles of 4. So that's kind of an interesting thing. And that was also another hard game to kind of end this. So the last game, as it so often is, proven to be the most difficult. And of course, people arrive at it with less time on average than maybe what they need. But this is also typically the way they're setting this up. The hardest game is usually 3rd or 4th. It is typically not 1st or 2nd.
Yeah. I want to give a quick shout out to you, buddy. My favorite thing to do. Which is you made specific mention of the idea that these types of games in the crystal ball before January and February, you noted very directly that pattern and circular games were very likely to make a reappearance. We saw some pattern elements back in January, and here we saw a pure test of circularity in this section. So, credit to you and your prognostications.
Woo for me. Usually I highlight the blog that we have about circularity. That's, kind of like the advanced circularity blog. And at least for January, what I highlighted was Do the Virus game, which, that had a lot of similarities to the last game for many people in the January test.
The government secret being leaked.
Yeah, what I would say is that again, the crystal ball that we had for January and February really played well because we felt like we were seeing some more outlier type games come into play after a long stretch without having them. So I think that really helped. I got a number of, again, nice comments from people who were like, that was great. I retweeted a few comments that people made. But John, here you have two real game sections that are in there. Were there any experimental game sections floating around?
Well, another hat tip to you and your predictions. No, I didn't see a single person with two sections of logic games or with an experimental section of logic games. In other words, the 8 games that I just mentioned were the only games that I have seen this entire week.
Yeah, same with me. Didn't hear any counter reports. Nobody came to me and said I had 2 logic game sections, which if they are going to phase out logic games mid-2024, which is kind of what our expectation is, we expected that there would be fewer uses of experimental logic games coming. And we saw some in January, less than the other 2 sections, but here we see none that we can track. And if anybody out there did have experimental logic games, by all means, send us a message. But at least as far as this goes, this is about what you'd expect is that if you're getting rid of a section in its current form, there's no need to continue testing it. And that's what experimental sections are all about, is pre-testing items. So this is consistent with what our expectations are. This is a great example of how we can predict things in the crystal ball. Let's go to reading comprehension then.
Let's do it. And this paired up nicely with what we saw on Friday morning with the games, because as I mentioned, those games came from January 2021, tests we're familiar with. And the first section of reading comprehension, real reading comprehension that we saw, came from that test as well. Although we had also seen these 4 passages a little more recently than January 2021. These were also used in June of 2022. So this is the 3rd straight year these have made an appearance. Here's what those 4 passages were. 27 questions. The first passage was a classic. It was on the Big Bang Theory and an essay by Neil deGrasse Tyson and questioning unorthodox explanations and theories about events. Basically, stay skeptical, but be willing to accept maybe unorthodox explanations of things like the Big Bang. I think there's some mention of Einstein and relativity in that passage as well. The second passage there, a favorite of yours, I suspect, was a discussion, criticism really, of Kafka's work. That was the comparative passage in this section.
Yes, I'd like to read that.
I know you're a Kafka fan. The third passage was the legal passage, legal evasion in this case. They talked about essentially how people try to get out of certain things or skirt the law and evade what responsibilities they might have. And they used this idea of water pollution as an example. I imagine something with like dumping rights and regulations and how corporations skirt that. And then finally, it concluded with the fourth passage on diplomacy and diplomats and their responsibilities in foreign relations, I think in the UN specifically. And that was a tricky passage to end with. This is a hard section.
This is a hard section, and we've seen it, as you said, 3 years in a row. And I will add a kind of a shout out to you at this point, because when we were going through that crystal ball, we talked about topics that you should be familiar with in reading comprehension. And the first 3 topics here, kind of like cosmology, Big Bang Theory, Kafka as well, were all on your list of things that you should just be familiar with topically, that we're seeing a lot of this. And it's kind of like, I've said this to people before. It's great that we can do the crystal balls the way we do it. This one that we did for January and February might be the most on point that we've ever seen. It gets hard, though, at times. This is a golden era of prediction right now. And you and I both, in the sections that we did, were able to kind of like nail a few things. Quite honestly, we shouldn't be able to tell people that Kafka is a kind of topic that you should be familiar with and then have it actually appear on their LSAT. That's beyond prognostication.
It's almost like proper clairvoyance.
We're voyeurs into what's happening actually in LSAC's Newtown, Pennsylvania headquarters. But pretty powerful from you. But that, again, also a scored section, not an easy one. There was another real section that was floating around out there as well. What was that one all about?
Yeah, we saw this one on Friday as well, but I think primarily Saturday is where most people probably face this. 27 questions as well, and this was a set of new passages. In other words, I haven't seen these previously. The 4 passages in this real section were on these topics. The first was about an African-American community, I think, migrating to and establishing itself in Brooklyn, Illinois. desegregating schools. There's this historian whose name I'm going to butcher, Sha Jua, I think, who this kind of referenced the studies of this historian in this passage. Really fascinating. I had never heard any of this, Dave, as a bit of an aside, and I've actually been reading a little bit about Brooklyn, Illinois, starting with the Wikipedia page and then diving deeper, and it's fascinating, the history of that town and what happened there, for anyone who's interested. Second passage was the comparative passage, and it was about people's taste in music, specifically whether it was an evolutionary adaptation or more of just a happy accident. Did we develop our taste in music to attract a mate, for instance, or is it just something that seems almost incidental? The third passage, a tricky one, was about consciousness and creativity, incubation theories and stuff, and whether subconsciousness plays a role and what role it plays in problem solving. And then finally, it finished with another tricky passage, the fourth passage, about, you're not going to see me do air quotes, but I'll tell you that I'm doing them, having the, quote, right to do something versus being morally, quote, right, disobeying the law, for instance. So a legal passage there around the idea of what it actually means to be in the right, legally in the right or morally in the right, and how you distinguish. Another tough section.
Yeah, but an interesting sounding one. Even if at times rather abstract in terms of the content, especially in the last two passages.
Yeah, despite its lack of Kafka, I think it's probably still an interesting set.
You know, the Kafka passage will be a great one when I finally see it, because I know a lot about Kafka. I'm a fan of the works. I generally don't like bureaucracy, and I'd be very interested to see what the interpretation is of it, the type of questions that they're asking, and to see how much outside knowledge really plays a role in that. Same thing with like stuff with like Big Bang Theory and cosmology for you, where it's like,
I know that.
How much do I?
Yeah, that Neil deGrasse Tyson essay, that passage is apparently built off of, I've read before, even though it's from,
Exactly.
I think, 96.
I love to see how closely they mirrored it, how much that pre-knowledge actually makes a difference. But just having some kind of familiarity with who these characters were or what the concept is, it gives you comfort. And comfort during the LSAT is something that is hard to get when you're under time pressure. And even if you're like, well, I only know who Kafka was and I understood the general outlook, you've got an advantage.
Huge advantage.
That's what the business of what we do is to give people an advantage. And the fact that the crystal ball is free and gives people these kinds of, at times, massive advantages. Again, we talked about the best deal in LSAT prep earlier. Maybe the crystal ball is the best deal in LSAT prep.
So we'll see you on March 15th.
We'll see you on March 15th if you're taking any of those tests coming up.
There was one more set of RC passages floating around, but it was an experimental section. So I'll run through these four as well. These would have been paired up with another one of the two real sections that we just discussed. So if you did have two sets of RC, and you should hopefully have recognized one of your sets from what we just went through, this should be your other set. Experimental 27 questions, and very quickly, these were the topics. The first was about technology and automation predictions. To something that largely failed to come true. It's a historical guy making predictions about the future that didn't quite land. Second passage was about music copyright laws and how the guidelines aren't specific enough, basically. Like the two real sections, that second passage was comparative in this set, too. Third passage, modern Chilean folk band recreating an activist, Violeta Parra, I think her name was, recreating her music to make it a little more contemporary. And then finally, it finished, the fourth passage, English language rules for spelling, for pronunciation, and went into the history of printing and the printing press, I believe, Gutenberg. This seemed to be, and I'll echo a fine point. I'm going to make a fine distinction of something you said earlier. This seemed to be an easier set of passages than the real ones that we looked at. Notice I said relative, easier. Not easy, but not quite as challenging as the two sections that were real, from what I could gather.
Yeah, and some, obviously for some people it's like, darn, that means probably the harder section for me was the scored section. Again, you'll, hopefully get a scale kind of movement from that harder RC. This passage set sounds really interesting to me, though, like English language rules, surprisingly. The music copyright law, I know a fair bit about that. Even like the failed Nostradamus of, predictions passage sounds pretty interesting. And that's always the first thing that I look at with reading comprehension is just like, will I even be interested in reading it? And then the other passage on there, the Violeta Parra one, is about, recreating music. And you and I are both big music fans. So I think that one sounds like a winner for me in terms of topic. Just keep this in mind. It may not have been scored this time, but it will be in the future. So that's the good news. Someone in the future will get this and be able to say, all right, that was a fun section to read, or at least it wasn't the worst section I've ever read.
Right. Yeah, there's a reason we're still routinely seeing experimental reading comp, less so games, is because these reading comp passages are coming back. So you may get your wish one of these days, Dave. You may get to see that for real.
Which actually brings us to a really interesting point with logical reasoning, because as we go through the logical reasoning scored section, there were certainly experimentals that were floating around out there. Because of how confusing logical reasoning experimental is, we've stopped covering it as a discussion because a lot of times it just confuses the issue more. But we know that there were experimental sections for logical reasoning that were floating around. However, this test is unique in the sense that, as far as we can tell, only a single logical reasoning section was used for all test takers as the scored section. It appears that every single test taker out there had the same LR section in common. That section, I'll just run through a bunch of different question topics. It's hilarious, John, because you and I basically have this entire section mapped out from 1 to 26.
Well, when it's the only one that everyone sees, it's pretty easy to feel good about your data.
Yeah, so I won't run through it from question 1 to 26, but I'll just run through some notable questions. Baby products that are made for safety but end up being recalled more frequently. Plant germination when the seeds are planted shallowly versus more deeply, I think, kind of exposed to wind. Political debate and calling a plan for tax relief or calling it tax relief. Bacteria and nitrogen fixation in the roots of grass. Fossils on Earth versus fossils on Mars. Vitamin E preventing Parkinson's disease. A question that a lot of people talked about as being exceedingly difficult. Islands in a lake connected by bridges.
Yeah.
I love that idea. Reminds me of an old logic game from 1992. Weight loss due to the amount of salt in diet. Cleaning up on the East Bank versus the West Bank and how one was more cost efficient. And then a topic that we've seen before, stickleback fish.
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned that.
Was a brutally difficult question back on the November 2019 LSAT, the PT89, a question that I went out and explained on our forum in detail because I felt it was so hard and it had enough nuance that it was really one that I wanted to explain myself. I
reread that over the weekend, by the way, when I first started hearing about stickleback fish as part of this test. I was like, surely. Have they used that again? Do they have a stickleback fish expert on staff? And so I've pulled up your forum explanation for that PT89 question. It's really good.
I think it's strong. I spent a while on it, and now I feel like I myself am a stickleback expert, as opposed to a nickelback expert, of which I'm not, but a stickleback fish I am an expert on now. But this was the only real logical reasoning. So wherever you had all those question topics, that was your real section. And if you had 2 LR, any other LR that you had, and I saw one in use quite frequently, that was not real. And that, John, brings us to a astounding fact when we take a look at how many sections that we had that were real here. 2 logic games, 2 reading comprehension, 1 logical reasoning for the majority of people that were out there. And again, if anybody had anything else, send us a message. That leads to 4 forms total.
By far the fewest we've seen. Yeah, by far. Since they started doing this mix match stuff way back in the 2020s. May 2020, I think, was the first time we saw this, like multiple forms at once. They have never used this few. We've seen them use as many as like 50 plus combinations. Never have I seen them use so few as 4, which means I want to put a disclaimer on that logical reasoning. When you said that this test was unique, you didn't mean unusual. You meant genuinely one of a kind. This is the only time, to my knowledge, that they've only used a single logical reasoning section for everyone.
Since we started this kind of like online, at-home testing environment. In the past, they certainly did this. But it highlights a really interesting thing that we've seen throughout the pandemic and now in the aftermath, which is they were so freaked out by security that the early tests that they gave, 30, 40, 50 different combinations, multiple LR, multiple RC, multiple logic games in use as scored sections were the norm. And you and I kept saying, they don't need to do this. It's really hard to figure out. People aren't talking as much as you think. And even when they are, they're not sharing accurate information because they get confused between what section's what. They could use fewer real scored sections, and they are now doing that. So it's been a slow process. We've seen it come down into the 20s, into the teens, then into the single digits. We saw 8 before. Now we've seen 4 combinations. And I think this is probably going to be the norm, somewhere between 4 and 8 for each individual test. This is such a small administration that having a low number of combinations doesn't present any security issues. When the tests start getting bigger, they'll add a few extra scored sections, up the number of combinations. But this really helped people after the test in terms of saying, wow, well, I had that LR. And you saw a lot of people being like, I had that LR too. And I'm like, yes, you all had the same LR. Some of you just had a second one that wasn't scored.
Right.
But this was the real one.
Yeah, combine that with no experimental games floating around. And this was one of the easier tests, at least on our end, I think, to just keep things clean and clear. And again, if we missed anything, this is the disclaimer I was going to add to LR. If there's someone out there who had a single LR section and we just listed a bunch of questions you didn't have, first of all, burden's on you. Where were you? We could have really used that information.
Call me, man.
But yeah, second of all, let us know, because I would love to hear it. But right now, we just have this single LR. It's kind of fascinating.
Which brings us to the scoring scale matrix,
Yeah.
part of which has been established through prior use of this test. So that makes our life a little bit easier right away. It's not even an estimation. It's kind of going back, and we've already confirmed that we felt comfortable with what our prediction was previously, because it's something that we always do. So a part of this is already locked in stone for us. We just made sure that nothing had changed in the sections. But let's talk about how we predict scoring scales. We are going to focus on how many questions that you can miss and still achieve a 170. So we're going to talk about negatives ultimately. -7, -8, -9. That means you could miss 7, 8, or 9 questions to get a particular score, in this case, the 170 score. So we start with a baseline of -7, meaning that the average, so to speak, or the baseline before we start adding in difficulty is that you could miss 7 questions out of your 75 or 76 and get a 170. Then as we go through these scales, as we look at each section, what you do is you track which section did I have, which RC, which LG, and then how does that affect the scale? It could conceivably tighten the scale and take it to -6. That doesn't happen today. It could have no effect and leave it at -7, or it could loosen it and take it to -8. And then each time we reassess after we're through each section. So starting at -7, you can miss 7 questions to get a 170. We try to be on the conservative side as well. Let's take a look at that first logic game section from January 2021, the semester classes, the lawyer cases, the medical panel, and then the article start and end pages 1 through 5, and then I think 16 through 18. It's not going to make people all that happy, but we have done this a couple of times now, and we always have this as not moving the scale on the 23 questions. It keeps you at -7. Not saying that's easy. I'm just saying that that is what is expected with logic games. So apologies there, but we have made that prediction before. We have triple checked it at this point against past performance. We didn't see any changes to the content or the wording of this section. We're keeping it as we had it before. The other logic game section, if you had that one, that's the volunteer shifts, the conferences with the city speakers and the topics, the fiction and nonfiction, and then closing off with the 8 people separated into 2 tables of 4. This, we believe, is the harder of the 2 logic games section. Does it move the scale an entire way? You and I have had some debate about this, John, and there's a part of me that feels that it does, that this really loosens it from 7 to 8. Because of how we feel with logical reasoning, though, we've chosen to make this really kind of like a 0.5, meaning that even though it is the harder of the 2, it's not going to move it at 170, but it is definitely going to move it at 160.
Yeah.
And probably even earlier than that, probably at 165, 167, somewhere in there.
Yeah, my take on this is that novelty, like a circular game kind of out of nowhere, unless you were listening to us in advance, doesn't hit people in the 170s quite as hard as it does people in, say, the mid to lower 160s or into the 150s. So seeing that circular game for a 170 type of score, it's still manageable. Was the section as a whole harder than the other? I think so. Do I think it probably nudges the needle at 170? I do. I don't know that it nudges it a full point, though.
Yeah, I think it's usually that you're a little bit
I
more loose
know.
on the scale. I'm more conservative, and you and I feel differently this time. My feeling is it probably does nudge it, but I'm also willing to be more conservative on this just because we know how it works. And again, this is exactly why we want people to listen to what we have to say, because there is a slight difference of opinion here. It's not huge, but it also means that, hey, if you went through that section, you're like, no, it was totally brutal, go ahead and count it as moving the scale one.
Yeah.
I'm okay with it. And I know John ultimately is too.
Well, I know why you want people to listen to what we have to say. It's because they're going to like what you had to say better.
That's almost never the case. So here, let me take my victory and move on. All right. So pretty much everybody is 7.5 here, maybe 8, depending on how they're looking at it. But let's move on to reading comprehension, and now we'll start with wherever you're at with your number. And the good news is all the reading comprehension is going to loosen the scale 1. We know that the Big Bang, Kafka, legal evasion, and diplomacy and foreign relations, we've seen this before from January 2021, and then later on, I think in June 2022, we know that this loosens it by 1. We're very comfortable with that as a hard section. So if you were sitting it at, say, -7, to get a 170 from, say, that first one, the one about the article start and end pages, logic games, this would move you automatically to missing 8 questions. And that's also the case with the one about Brooklyn, Illinois, and the musical taste, and then the meaning of right. That would also move you. So everybody has the same exact impact from reading comprehension as well. Loosens the scale by 1, and that takes us to LR. And you and I had a long conversation about this because most LR for us historically has been no movement of the scale.
Right.
And I think this section was tougher, especially in the early questions. But even the last questions, like off the top of my head, I can't remember if that question on the bridges was like 20 or 22, but that's a tough question. Like there are legitimately people saying, I'm not sure I could solve that one, even if I had, 20 minutes to do it. And so I think this was an above average difficulty section.
Yeah.
Does it move the scale entirely at 170? I think maybe it does, but I'm not entirely certain. But I know it moves it at least a little bit. It moves it at least 0.5. It definitely moves it downscale because of that difficulty. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I'm comfortable with that. Bridges was question 20. I feel about this a little bit the way that I feel about reading comp, which is that I don't know that there was any particular standout moment of just brutality. That Rawls theory of justice or Eileen Gray type of passage that just goes, forever in infamy. But the section as a whole had this almost tonality to it, this weight, where it just never quite let up. You never really got a long stretch of a break like you often get. I'm speaking specific about LR now. There were a couple of really tough LR questions in the first 10. Always a penalty. 26 questions as opposed to 25. So that alone means you've got to go a little faster. And yeah, there were some really, I think, just moments of pure difficulty regardless of your performance level or scoring ability throughout this section. So I do think it probably moves it at a 170. I don't know that I'd be willing to give this a full 1 point at a 170, though. So again, I'm being a little stingier. I don't know what's happening.
I feel a little looser about this because I feel like you could have it, which, again, use your own kind of feelings about this. If you're like, that felt pretty reasonable, let me keep it at 0.5. Don't have it move it at 170, have it move it at 160. If you're like, no, that really was brutal, and Dave, of course, is right, then go ahead and move it by 1. Which would mean that you're really looking at a range here from kind of like 8.5 to 9.5 in terms of moving that scale around, especially if you were a person who had the logic games of the 8 people at 2 tables, and then you had this, that you were at least at -9. Could you be at -10? Given the 76 questions, I definitely think it's possible, but it's a really difficult thing to, be certain about it at this kind of level.
Yeah, I think that's my bigger hesitation here is when you start to add it all together. I don't know that we had a -10 combination available. That would be looser than any test that we have, at least in the Flexish era, on file. PT's 90 and 92 are both -9 with 75 questions, I believe. So it's not unthinkable. I don't know that this quite got there, but this was certainly on the harder end of tests that we've seen.
Yeah, I think, there's a lot of people who had -9 scales. That's the big takeaway from this. If you're like, gosh, man, they're really kind of like shading it and it's a fine line here. Yeah, we're running into difficulty with the way they're doing some of these things. Early difficult LR is bad for people downscale. They miss questions. They don't even know they've missed questions. And later on, they come back and they're like, well, I didn't like the section, but I didn't think I did that badly. And that's the kind of situation you get with an LR section like this, where it keeps, as you said, it puts pressure on you throughout. And then you have 26 questions. To me, I feel like that moves it. But I feel everybody taking this who had that kind of combination of the harder logic games could easily say, yeah, I feel like at -9. -10, it's an interesting one on the 76. We haven't really seen that, so that's something to consider, but it was not an easy test overall.
Yeah, that we do agree on.
Yeah. So if those of you who are out there like, that was a tough test, we're agreeing with you. We're not saying it was easy. This isn't like, oh, gee, it's -6 or 7 and nothing moved the scale. There's all sorts of difficulty on this exam. It's all a matter of really which combination that you had and how it hit you. And that's pretty much, I think, the overview.
Yeah, I think that covers it. So definitely an interesting test week so far. But hopefully this is good news. I know there were a lot of people feeling pretty dejected coming out of this test from the difficulty of it to some of the issues that we talked about with ProctorU and technical stuff. So hopefully this is something of a salve. This is a soothing postmortem.
Well, we'll find out on Wednesday, March 1st at 9 a.m. Eastern Time when scores come out.
That's all I've got, man.
Same, man.
It's me and my whiskey. I'm all out of thoughts.
It's time for me to go get a refill on this Fireball. I might actually just take a Fireball shot because that's one of the few shots that are in that whiskey family that I can take. It's got enough cinnamon to make me happy.
Didn't they just go through a lawsuit where their mini bottles were found not to have whiskey in them?
That was a different product that I believe, or maybe it was them, and that said something in really small letters there was no alcohol. Fortunately, I have a large bottle of Fireball that does contain alcohol, no mini bottles here.
Yeah, you're covered.
I am good. And
I wish I could be there and take Fireball shots with you, buddy. But in the meantime, pour one out for me.
Someday soon.
Hope so.
If you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you may find it. And if you've enjoyed it, please leave us a comment or a rating as well. And if you have any questions, please send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. I'm sure we'll do a mailbag episode sometime soon. On behalf of John and myself, we hope this was useful and helpful in understanding the February 2023 LSAT. We hope you crushed the exam. On that note, stay safe out there, and we'll talk to you soon.